People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil by M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled. Book 1, Toward a Psychology of Evil. Dr. Peck. This is a dangerous book. I have written it because I believe it is needed. I believe its overall effect will be healing. But I have also written it with trepidation. It has potential for harm. It will cause some readers pain. Worse, some may misuse its information to harm others. I plead with you to handle it with care. One meaning of care is love. Be gentle and loving with yourself if you find what is written causing you pain. And please be gentle and loving with those neighbors you may come to understand as evil. Be careful, full of care. Evil people are easy to hate, but remember St. Augustine's advice to hate the sin but love the sinner. Remember when you recognize an evil person that truly, there but for the grace of God, go I. In labeling certain human beings as evil, I am making an obviously severe critical value judgment. But the judgment needs to be made. It is the principal thesis of this work that these specific people, as well as human evil in general, need to be studied scientifically, not in the abstract, not just philosophically, but scientifically. And to do that, we must be willing to make judgments. But such judgments cannot be made safely unless we begin by judging and healing ourselves. The battle to heal human evil always begins at home. And self-purification will always be our greatest weapon. This book has been a work in process. I have not learned about human evil. I am learning. So do not regard anything heard here as the last word. Indeed, the purpose of the book is to lead us to dissatisfaction with our current state of ignorance on the subject. Let me begin by telling you about the case of the man who made a pact with the devil. George had always been a carefree person, or so he thought, until that afternoon in early October. It is true that he had the usual concerns of a salesman, a husband and father of 3, and the owner of a house with a roof that occasionally leaked and a lawn that always needed mowing. It is also true that he was an unusually neat and orderly person who tended to worry more than most if the lawn got a little high or the house paint a little chipped. And it is true that in the evenings, just as the sun was setting, he always experienced a strange mixture of sadness and dread. George was a top-notch salesman, a natural, 34, handsome, articulate, with an easy manner and a gift for storytelling. He was making close to $60,000 a year in salary and commissions. He had made it. The trouble started in Montreal. The company suggested that he go there for a manufacturers' convention. Since it was autumn, and neither he nor his wife Gloria had seen the fall foliage of the north, he decided to take her with him. They enjoyed it. The foliage was exquisite, and Gloria was in a reasonably good mood. On their last afternoon in Montreal, they went to see the cathedral, not because they were religious. George, having endured a fanatically religious mother, had a distinct antipathy to churches. Still, it was one of the sights, and they were sightseeing. He found it gloomy and uninteresting, and was happy when Gloria had had enough of it. As they were walking out, he spied a small contribution box near the massive door. He stopped in indecision. On the one hand, he had no genuine desire to give a penny to this or any church. On the other, he felt a small, unreasonable fear that he might be jeopardizing the stability of his life if he didn't. The fear embarrassed him. He was a rational man. But then it occurred to him that it would be quite rational to make a small contribution, just as it is rational to pay an admission price to a museum or an amusement park. He decided to give the change in his pocket, if it was not a large amount. He counted 55 cents in small coins and dumped them in the box.
That was the moment when that first thought hit him. It struck him like a blow, totally unexpected, dazing him. It was as if the words were suddenly written out in his mind. You are going to die at 55. George reached into his pocket for his wallet. Most of his cash was in traveler's checks, but he had a $5 and two $1 bills. He tore them from his wallet and stuffed them into the box. It was only when he was back in their hotel room that his panic began to subside. By the next day, as they were flying back to their home in North Carolina, George was feeling peaceful and confident. The incident was forgotten. 2 weeks later, driving on a sales trip in Kentucky, George came to a sign announcing a curve in the road and a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. As he passed the sign, another thought came to him, etched in his mind as before. You will die at 45. George felt uneasy the remainder of the day. This time, however, he was able to consider his experience a little more objectively. Both thoughts had to do with numbers. First 55, now 45. If they were consistent, then he might have something to worry about. But they were just numbers without significance. By the next day, he was his old self again. A week passed. As George drove into a small village, a sign announced that he was entering Upton, North Carolina. The third thought came. You will be murdered by a man named Upton. George began to be seriously worried. 2 days later, driving past an old abandoned railroad station, the words flashed again. The roof of that building will collapse with you inside, killing you. Thereafter, the thought came almost every day, always when he was driving, working his territory. George started dreading the mornings on which he faced business trips. He was preoccupied when he was working, and he lost his sense of humor. Food ceased to taste good. It was difficult to get to sleep at night, but it was all still bearable until the morning he drove across the Roanoke River. Immediately afterward, he had the thought, that's the last time you'll ever cross that bridge. Lying in bed that night, George wrestled with his dilemma. The bridge across the Roanoke was one of his most traveled routes. To avoid it, he would have to go several hundred miles out of his way each month, or else drop several. God damn it, it was absurd. Slightest shred of evidence that these thoughts represented anything. On the other hand, they weren't real. That's it. He could prove they weren't real. If he were to go over the Roanoke and not die, it would prove the thought to be. But if the thought were true. At 1 o'clock in the morning, George reached the decision to risk his life. Better to die than live tormented. He dressed silently in the darkness and slipped out of the house. 73 miles back to the Roanoke Bridge. He drove very carefully. When the bridge finally loomed up before him, there was such a tightness in his chest he could hardly breathe. But he went ahead, over the bridge, 2 miles down the road. Then he turned around and drove back across the bridge toward home. He had made it. He had proved the thought was wrong. By the time he let himself back into the house at dawn, he was ecstatic. He felt well for the first time in 2 months. There was no more fear. Until 3 nights later. Returning home in the afternoon from another day's trip, he passed a deep excavation at the side of the road near Fayetteville. Before it is filled, your car will drive straight into that excavation and you will be killed. At first, George almost laughed about this latest thought. Yet that night, the more he considered it, the more anxious he became. Sleep was impossible. Once more, George dressed in the middle of the night and slipped out of the house. The pattern of George's illness now became more fixed and devastating. Every day or two on the road, he would have a new thought about his death. Following the thought, his anxiety would rise to the point at which it was no longer bearable. At that point, he would feel compelled to drive back to the spot where he had experienced the thought. Once he had done this, he felt fine again until the next day and the next thought. Then the cycle would start over. George stood it for 6 more weeks. Every other night he was driving around the Carolina countryside. He slept less and less. He lost 15 pounds. His work performance slipped. Finally, one evening in February, he broke down. Weeping in exasperation, he told Gloria of his torment. Gloria knew of me from a friend. She called me the next morning, and that afternoon I saw George for the first time. I explained to George that he was suffering from a classical obsessive-compulsive neurosis, that the, quote, thoughts, unquote, that bothered him were what we psychiatrists called obsessions, and that the need to return to the scene of the thought was a compulsion. "You're right," he exclaimed. "It is a compulsion. I don't want to go back to where I have these thoughts. You know, that's the worst part of it. If it were just these thoughts, I think I could stand it, but it's this compulsion to go back that's killing me, that's robbing me of my sleep, that's driving me nuts. My compulsions are even worse than, what do you call them? My obsessions. They're what's driving me crazy." Here George paused, looking at me anxiously. "Do you think I'm going crazy?" "No," I replied. "You're still very much a stranger to me. But on the surface of things, I don't see any sign that you're going crazy. But I do think you have a major problem. And I think if you don't get extensive treatment, you're likely to continue to be crippled." 3 days later, when George returned to see me for the second time, he radiated confidence and aplomb. I attempted to learn more about the circumstances of his life, but there was little to grab a hold of. "I don't really have anything that's bothering me, Dr. Peck, except these little obsessions and compulsions. And I haven't had any of those since I saw you last. Oh, I admit I have concerns, but that's different from real worries. I'm concerned about how the children are doing in school. Deborah, our oldest, who's 13, is probably going to need braces. George Jr., he's 11, doesn't get very good grades. And Christopher, who's 6, he's just starting school. I must admit that in my heart I favor him a bit more than the older two, but I make an effort not to show it, and I think I succeed. So that's not a problem. We're a stable family. Good marriage. Oh, Gloria has her moods, but I guess all women are like that. Our sex life? Oh, that's fine. No problem there. Except, of course, when Gloria's in a bitchy mood, and then neither of us feels like it. But that's par for the course, isn't it? My childhood? Well, I can't say it was really always happy. When I was 9, my father had a nervous breakdown. He had to be hospitalized at the state hospital. Schizophrenia, I guess they called it. I suppose that's the reason I was worried last time you might think I was going crazy. You see, my father never came out of it, and died when I was in college. But I don't think any of that really disturbed me. My sister, who was 2 years younger, and I got plenty of attention. Mom was a good mother. She's a bit religious, overly so for my taste. She was always dragging us to churches, which I hated. But that's the only thing I can fault her for. Anyway, we were really close to my grandparents, my mother's parents. For a while, when my father was first in the hospital, we even lived with them. I especially loved my grandmother. That reminds me, I remembered something after our last meeting. Talking about compulsions brought it back to my mind that I also had a compulsion when I was around 13. I don't know how it started, but I got this feeling that my grandmother would die unless I touched a certain rock each day. It wasn't a big deal. All I had to do was just remember to touch it. Anyway, I grew out of it after a year or so. It makes me think I'm also going to grow out of my recent obsessions and compulsions. I think maybe it's over. Possibly all I needed was the little talk we had earlier in the week. You can't imagine what a reassurance it was for me to know that I wasn't going crazy. I think it probably did the trick. I doubt that I need psychoanalysis. So I'd rather not make another appointment. I mildly attempted to remonstrate with George. I told him it seemed to me that nothing substantial had changed in his existence. I suspected that his symptoms would shortly recur in some form or another. 2 days later, George called me, frantic. "You were right, Dr. Peck. The thoughts have come back. I can't go on like this." So George resumed therapy and continued in it because his obsessions and compulsions continued. Over the next 3 months, while he was seeing me twice a week, I gradually learned that George had a great deal more to worry about than just his symptoms. His sex life, which he had told me was fine, proved abysmal. Gloria and he had intercourse once every 6 weeks, and then as an almost violent, quick, animalistic act when both of them were drunk. Gloria's bitchy moods turned out to last for weeks. I met with her and found her to be significantly depressed, filled with hatred towards George, who she described as a weak, sniveling slob. George, in turn, slowly began to express an enormous amount of resentment towards Gloria, whom he saw as a self-centered, totally unsupportive and unloving woman. He was completely alienated from his 2 older children, Deborah and George Jr. He felt that Gloria had been responsible for turning them against him. In the whole family, Christopher was the only one with whom he had a relationship, and he recognized that he was probably spoiling the boy to keep him out of Gloria's clutches. Although he had acknowledged from the beginning that his childhood had been less than ideal, as I pushed him to recollect it, George slowly started to realize that it had been more damaging and frightening than he liked to believe. He was able to remember, for instance, his 8th birthday, when his father killed his sister's kitten. He was sitting on his bed when the kitten came tumbling into the room. His father came in right after it, crazy with rage, carrying a broom. The kitten had apparently made a mess on the living room rug. As George crouched on his bed, screaming for him to stop, his father proceeded to beat the kitten to death with the broom. That was a year before his father finally had to go to the state hospital. George was also able to recognize that his mother was almost as deranged as his father. One night when he was 11, she had kept him awake until dawn, forcing him to pray on his knees for the survival of their minister, who had had a heart attack. George had hated the minister and hated the Pentecostal church to which his mother took him every Wednesday evening, every Friday evening, and all day Sunday, year in and year out. Nor was his life with his grandparents as idyllic as he had wanted to remember it. During the 2 years they lived with his grandparents, his grandfather beat his grandmother almost weekly. Each time George was afraid that his grandmother would be killed. Often he was fearful of leaving the house, feeling that somehow, even by his helpless presence, he might be able to prevent her murder. These pieces of information and others had to be pried out of George. He repeatedly complained that he did not see the point of dwelling on the seemingly unsolvable problems of his present life and remembering the painful facts of his past. "All I want," he said, "is to get rid of these ideas and my compulsions. I don't see how talking about unpleasant things that are over and done with is going to help me get rid of these symptoms." "One of the reasons you have these symptoms," I explained, "is that they act as a smokescreen. You are so busy constantly thinking and talking about your obsessions and compulsions that you don't have the time to think about the more basic problems that are causing them. Until you have dealt in much greater depth with your miserable marriage and your ghastly childhood, you're going to continue to be tortured by your symptoms." It also became clear that George was equally reluctant to face the issue of death. "I know I'm going to die someday, but why think about it? It's morbid. Besides, nothing can be done about it." "Actually, George, you're thinking about death all the time," I said. "What do you think your obsessions and compulsions are all about, if not death? And what about your anxiety at the time of sunset? Isn't it clear to you that you hate sunsets because the sunset represents the death of the day, and that reminds you of your own death? You're terrified of death. That's okay. So am I. But you're trying to avoid that terror rather than face it. Your problem is not that you think about death, but the way you think about it. Until you are able to think about death, despite its terror, voluntarily, You will continue to think about it involuntarily in the form of your obsessions. But no matter how well I phrased the issue, George seemed to be in no hurry to deal with it. There was, however, no doubt that George was suffering greatly from his obsessions and compulsions. He took to calling me from the road when he was experiencing them. "Dr. Peck," he would say, "I'm in Raleigh, and I just had another one of my thoughts a couple of hours ago. I don't know what to do. I want to go home, but I feel I have to go back. Please, Dr. Peck, help me. Tell me what to do. Tell me I can't go back. Tell me I shouldn't give in to the compulsion." Each time I would patiently explain to George that only he had the power to make his own decisions, and that it was not healthy for him to want me to make his decisions for him. But my response made no sense to him. Each session he would remonstrate with me. "Dr. Peck, I know if you were to tell me I can't go back anymore, I wouldn't. I'd feel so much better. I don't understand why you won't help me. You keep saying I've got to make up my own mind, but that's just what I can't do, don't you see? Don't you see the pain I'm in? Don't you want to help?" he would whine. It went on week after week, and George was visibly deteriorating. He developed diarrhea. He lost more weight and began looking more and more haggard. He became weepy much of the time. It looked as if George might soon need to be hospitalized. But then something suddenly seemed to change. One morning, a little less than 4 months after he began therapy, George came to his session whistling and obviously cheerful. I immediately commented on the change. "Yes, I certainly am feeling well today," George acknowledged. "I don't really know why. I had another one of my thoughts 2 days ago, but it didn't bother me. I told myself I'm not going to let these silly thoughts get to me anymore. I think I've finally got this problem licked." Ordinarily, I would have been delighted, but I did not have the slightest understanding of why George was getting better. Nothing in his life, or in the way he was dealing with his life, had changed. Then, out of the blue, he asked me, "Dr. Peck, do you believe in the devil?" "That's an odd question," I replied, "and a very complicated one. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason, just curious." "You're evading. What brought it to your mind? Why did you suddenly think about it right now in this particular session?" "Well, you see, you wouldn't do anything to prevent me from going back to those spots where my thoughts came to me. I had to do something to keep myself from giving in to my compulsions. So I did it." "Did what?" I asked. "I made a pact with the devil. I mean, I really don't believe in the devil, but I had to do something, didn't I? So I made this agreement that if I did give in to my compulsion and go back, then the devil would see to it that my thought came true. Do you understand?" "I'm not sure," I responded. "Well, for instance, the other day I had a thought near Chapel Hill. Ordinarily, I would have stewed about it for a couple of hours, and finally I would have gone back to prove that the thought wasn't true, right? But having made this pact, you see, I couldn't go back, because as part of the agreement, if I went back, the devil would see to it that I would be killed. Knowing I would be killed, there was no reason for me to go back. In fact, there was an incentive not to go back. Now do you understand?" "I understand the mechanics of it," I replied non-committally. "Well, they seem to work," George said happily. "Twice now I've had the thought, and neither time have I had to go back. I must admit I have a little bit of the guilties about it, though." "The guilties?" "You know, a feeling of guilt. I mean, people aren't supposed to make a pact with the devil, and all that, are they? Besides, I don't even really believe in the devil. But if it seems to work, so what?" I was silent. I had no idea what to say to George. I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the complexity of my own feelings. 5 minutes went by. George seemed quite discomfited by the silence. Finally, he broke it. "Well, I guess there is a little bit more I haven't told you," he said. "And I guess there's another reason that I have the guilties a little bit. You see, there was another part to my agreement with the devil. Because I don't really believe in the devil, I couldn't really believe for certain that he would see to it that I was killed if I went back. For it to work, I had to have some insurance, something that would really keep me from going back. It occurred to me that the one thing I love most in the world is my son Christopher. So I made it part of the agreement that if I did give in to the compulsion and go back, the devil would see to it that Christopher died an early death. Not only would I die, but Christopher would too. Now you know why I can't go back anymore. Even if the devil's not real, I'm still not willing to risk Christopher's life on the issue. I love him so much. That's the part that really gives me the guilties. I fell silent again, slowly beginning to sort things out. George could not tolerate the silent waiting any longer. Well, what do you think? I think, George, that I am very glad you are having the guilties, as you call them. What do you mean? I mean that you should feel guilty. You have done something to feel guilty about. I would be very worried about you if you didn't feel guilty over what you've done. George immediately became wary. I thought psychotherapy was supposed to relieve me of my guilt feelings. Only those guilt feelings that are inappropriate, I replied. To feel guilty about something that is not bad is unnecessary and sick. Not to feel guilty about something that is bad is also sick. Do you think that I'm bad? I think that in making this pact with the devil, you have done something that is bad, something evil. But I haven't really done anything, George exclaimed. Don't you see? It's all been in my mind. You yourself have told me there's no such thing as a bad thought, a bad wish or feeling. Only what one actually does is bad, you've said. The first law of psychiatry, you called it. Well, I haven't done anything. I haven't lifted a finger against a single soul. But you have done something, George, I responded. You made a pact with the devil. But that's not doing anything. Can't you understand? It's all in my mind, a figment of my imagination. I don't even believe in the devil. If I had made a real pact with a real person, that would be another matter. How can you make a real pact with something that doesn't exist? It hasn't been a real action. George, I don't know any more about the devil than you do. I don't know whether it's a he, she, or an it. I don't know whether the devil's corporeal, or whether it's a force, or it's just a concept. But it doesn't matter. The fact remains that whatever it is, you made a contract with it. George, I'm going to say a few things to you. I want you to listen to them well. They're very important. Nothing is more important. You have a defect, a weakness in your character. Basically, George, you're a kind of coward. Whenever the going gets a little bit rough, you sell out. When you're faced with the realization that you're going to die one of these days, you run away from it. You don't think about it because it's morbid. When you're faced with the painful realization that your marriage is lousy, you run away from that too. Instead of facing it and doing something about it, you don't think about that either. And then because you've run away from these things that are really inescapable, they come to haunt you in the form of your symptoms, your obsessions and compulsions. These symptoms could be your salvation. You could say, these symptoms mean that I am haunted. I had better find out what these ghosts are and clean them out of my house. But you don't say that, because that would mean really facing some things that are painful. So you try to run away from your symptoms, too. Instead of facing them and what they mean, you try to get rid of them. And when they're not so easy to get rid of, you go running to anything that will give you relief, no matter how wicked or evil or destructive. You're always looking for the easy way out, George. Not the right way, the easy way, the painless way. In fact, you'll do anything to find the easy way out, even if it means selling your soul and sacrificing your son. As I said, I'm glad you're feeling guilty. If you didn't feel bad about taking the easy way out, I wouldn't be able to help you. You've been learning that psychotherapy is not the easy way out. If you're willing to face the painful realities of your life, I can be of some assistance. And I am sure that we will succeed. But if all you want is the easiest possible relief from pain, then I expect that you are the devil's man. And I don't see any way that psychotherapy can help you. It was George's turn to be silent. Finally, he spoke. In the comic books, once someone makes a pact with the devil, he can no longer get out of it. Once he's sold his soul, the devil won't give it back. Maybe it's too late for me to change. I don't know, George. As I told you, I don't know much about these things. Like you, I don't even know whether the devil really exists. But I think you really did make a pact with the devil. And because you did, I think for you the devil became real. In your desire to avoid pain, I think you called the devil into existence. Because you had the power to call him into existence, I think you also have the power to end his existence. Intuitively, in the deepest part of me, I feel the process is reversible. Dr. Peck, it would mean going back to a state of torment. I'm not sure that I can do it. I'm not sure I want to. George looked very sad. Are you going to see me Monday, George? Yes, I'll be here. That evening was the turning point in George's therapy. By Monday, his symptoms had returned in full force. But there was a change. He no longer pleaded with me to tell him to not go back. He was also more willing to examine in depth his fear of death and the enormous gulf of understanding and communication that existed between him and his wife. His symptoms, his obsessions and compulsions began with ups and downs to diminish in intensity several months after that night on which we discussed his pact with the devil. At the end of another year, they had petered out entirely. 2 years after it had begun, George terminated therapy. Still not the strongest of men, but stronger than before. The way psychiatrists are most accustomed to understanding human beings is in terms of health and disease. This viewpoint is known as the medical model. According to this viewpoint, George was suffering from a very specific disease, namely an obsessive-compulsive neurosis. A typical characteristic of people who are victims of this neurosis is their propensity for what psychiatrists call magical thinking. Magical thinking can take a variety of forms, but basically it is a belief that thoughts in and of themselves may cause events to occur. It was because George believed his thoughts would come to pass that he was compelled, time and time again, to travel mile after mile back to the scene of his thoughts so as to nullify or undo their power. Looked at in this light, George's pact with the devil was simply another manifestation of his magical thinking. The pact seemed to George a feasible maneuver to obtain relief from his suffering, precisely because he believed it would come true. Although the pact was all in his mind, George believed he and his son would both actually die in accordance with its conditions. Restricting ourselves to the medical model, we might say of George's pact with the devil that it was merely one of the many forms his magical thinking took, and that his magical thinking was a typical feature of the common mental illness from which he suffered. And since the phenomenon can be understood in these terms, there is no need for further analysis. Case closed. The problem is that, viewed in this light, the relationship between George and the devil seems prosaic and not very significant. How would it seem if we viewed it instead in terms of a traditional Christian religious model? According to this model, humanity, and perhaps the entire universe, is locked in a titanic struggle between the forces of good and evil, between God and the devil. The battleground of this struggle is the individual human soul. The entire meaning of human life revolves around the battle. The only question of ultimate significance is whether the individual soul will be one to God or one to the devil. By establishing through his pact a relationship with the devil, George had placed his soul in the greatest jeopardy known to man. It was clearly the critical point of his life, and possibly even the fate of all humanity turned upon his decision. What is the meaning of George's pact? Just another neurotic symptom, or the crucial turning point of his existence with cosmic significance? Science seeks, as far as it might, to penetrate the mystery of the world. And ever so gradually, scientists are beginning to become comfortable embracing multiple models. However, science has not yet become exactly broad-minded. This book is entitled Toward a Psychology of Evil, precisely because we do not yet have a body of scientific knowledge about human evil deserving of being called a psychology. Why not? The concept of evil has been central to religious thought for millennia, yet it is virtually absent from our science of psychology, which one might think would be vitally concerned with the matter. The major reason for this strange state of affairs is that the scientific and the religious models have hitherto been considered totally immiscible, like oil and water, mutually incompatible and rejecting. Science has also steered clear of the problem of evil because of the immensity of the mystery involved. It is not that scientists have no taste for mystery, so much as that their attitude and methodology in approaching it is generally reductionistic. Theirs is a left-brain analytical style. Their standard procedure is to bite off tiny little pieces at a time, and then to examine such pieces in relative isolation. They prefer little mysteries to big ones. Theologians suffer no such compunction. For some, religion is a way to approach mystery. They are not reluctant to use more integrative right-brain means of exploration: meditation, intuition, feeling, faith, and revelation. For them, the bigger the mystery, the better. The problem of evil is a very big mystery indeed. It does not submit itself easily to reductionism. We shall, however, find that some questions about human evil can be reduced to a size manageable for proper scientific investigation. Nonetheless, in common with any early attempt at scientific exploration, we shall end up with more questions than answers. The problem of evil, for instance, can hardly be separated from the problem of goodness. Were there no goodness in the world, we would not even be considering the problem of evil. It is a strange thing. Dozens of times I have been asked by patients or acquaintances, "Dr. Peck, why is there evil in the world?" Yet no one has ever asked me, "Why is there good in the world?" If we seriously think about it, it probably makes more sense to assume this is a naturally evil world that has somehow been mysteriously contaminated by goodness, rather than the other way around. The mystery of goodness is even greater than the mystery of evil. Bear in mind also that just as the issue of evil inevitably raises the question of the devil, so the inextricable issue of goodness raises the question of God and creation. While we can, and I believe should, bite off little pieces of mystery upon which to gnash our scientific teeth, we are approaching matters vast and magnificent beyond our comprehension. Whether we know it or not, we are literally treading upon holy ground. A sense of awe is quite befitting. In the face of such holy mystery, it is best we remember to walk with the kind of care that is born both of fear and love.